verses 38 to 48. It's actually in your bulletin, so. Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But, I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But, I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father, Mother is perfect. The Gospel of Christ.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you. I confess I'm feeling a little bit weary today. I just got back from doing a wedding with Denise. Actually was DJing, and I was officiating in Cumberland, which is a new place for me, up Island. And we just came back on Friday this morning, well, kind of right around noon, so feeling I was kind of finishing the sermon on the ferry and feeling a little bit scattered, but as you were coming in today, I just was feeling so privileged to do this with you every couple of weeks, and just love the chance to dig into this stuff together, to sing with you, and yeah, so I'm grateful, even though, you know, Mark has abandoned us for quite a while now. He's flying home today, actually, so tonight I think he felt kind of bad that he was missing this, but he'll be with us next time, so we will survive without him. Thank you to everybody who's volunteered to help in his absence. I think it's a good thing for us to share this work. I need to give credit where credit is due. I owe part of my sermon title to Sonia, who preached for us last time. Both of us are covering the same section where Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said, but I tell you," and Sonia told me she wished she had called her sermon, "I like big butts." And I happen to believe that my butts are even bigger than Sonia's this week. This section of the Sermon on the Mount is often called the high water mark, the most demanding part of the whole sermon. Jesus is inaugurating this new world order and taking hold of the future and kind of yanking it and letting it, whoa, not like that, but letting it spill into the present moment. The kingdom of God is drawn near, the time is fulfilled, the time is filled to the full, so the law also has to be fulfilled, also has to be filled up. It's time to learn how to be righteous, as Sonia said last time, to be in right relationships. So following the letter of the law will not make us righteous. That's really clear from this first section that Joy read on swearing oaths. People were using these sneaky loopholes in the law in order to manipulate each other. So they would swear by the heavens or by the earth or Jerusalem or the hairs on their head, and later they would feel free to break those oaths without consequences because they hadn't sworn by God's name. But that's silly, of course, because God is the creator of all those things and is present everywhere, which is what Jesus is trying to say. So don't try to protect or justify your own deceit. Instead, lead with truth. Be so trustworthy that it's unnecessary to make any oaths at all. Relate rightly to each other, Jesus says. I'm very prone to swear or to break my word, but as I was thinking about Jesus' words here, I felt convicted by my own temptation, which is flattery. As an Enneagram 2, I don't know how many people are into the Enneagram here. In other words, as someone who has a need to be needed and a fear of being unwanted or unlovable, I often feel tempted to tell people what I think that they would like to hear. And I needed this reminder this week to speak in truth. But the next couple of buts are even more challenging for Enneagram 2s like me, because we're prone to overextend ourselves in helping people, and then resent it, and them, and to love in kind of a transactional way, so expecting that we will get something in return for that love. And then also, as a recovering perfectionist, that last verse makes me cringe, so we're going to have to dig into that too. So let's dive more into this middle section where Jesus addresses what's called the lex talionis, or the law of the tooth. I really liked that. Law of the tooth. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. This law often sounds barbaric to us now, but it was originally required in Mosaic law to limit violence. So in a culture where vengeful vendettas could cycle for generations, kind of like the mafia almost, where it just kind of amplified, this law made it clear that vengeance could only be carried out by the court at the courthouse, and only the equivalent amount, and no more. So in this way, violence, the cycle of violence, would be broken. But Jesus wants us to go further, stopping that cycle even earlier. But I tell you, Jesus says, do not resist an evil person. Now it kind of sounds like what Jesus is saying is, let evil people do whatever they want to you. And telling us to kind of become their punching bags or their doormats to walk all over. But Jesus doesn't tend to be a very passive person, so we need to dive in a bit deeper. Do not resist an evil person. This word resist is actually a word that's most often used in military contexts, in the context of drawing up an army into battle. So I think Jesus is saying, do not resist evil with evil. Do not resist violence with violence. Do not encounter evil in its own way. If you do, you'll only be a mirror, an echo. You'll risk becoming the very thing that you hate, the thing that you're trying to stop. Meeting violence with violence is using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, which according to Audre Lorde will never bring lasting change. So what other options do we have? Usually when it comes to a threat, we think fight or flight, either aggression or total passivity. But in my experience, Jesus doesn't like binaries like that. He likes to queer the binaries. And in the words of American poet William Stafford, rushing to violence just displays a failure of the imagination. There are so many other possible responses to evil. And Jesus gives us some examples here. Turning the other cheek, giving away the coat, going the extra mile. Now growing up, I understood these verses in the context of killing them with kindness. Have you ever heard this kind of interpretation? Not only are we supposed to resist retaliating, we should also do extra nice things to sort of prove that we're better than them. But that's such a goody-goody, self-righteous approach to this passage, and it robs these examples of their subversive power, the power plays that I'm calling holy mischief. When Jesus' audience, the original audience, heard these examples, these ideas, I don't think that they would have nodded piously and said, yes, that's what we should do. No, I think they would actually have laughed in delight. I picture Jesus pausing with a wink after each one of them. Because each example is about embarrassing the oppressor. To really grasp this, we need to remember who Jesus is addressing here on this mountain. And as we've said before in this series, they were marginalized, oppressed people, poor, hungry, persecuted. Just think back to the Beatitudes at the beginning. Jesus has seen them humiliated and degraded at the hands of the Romans, not to mention their Jewish masters, teachers, and priests who looked down on them in contempt. And I think that's part of what motivated Jesus to start his sermon by blessing them, by saying, you are blessed, you are salt, you are light. And here, he offers them more chances to reclaim their dignity. So we're going to look at those three examples one by one, using insights from nonviolent theologian Walter Wink, who brought them to life for me when I first encountered his writing several years ago. You might already be familiar with his take, but it's worth a reminder. So first, turn the other cheek. I'm going to need a volunteer to help with this one. Denise, come on up. with your cheek. Please come on up here.
Which one?
Which one? Oh man. So we often picture this scenario in the context of a fist fight, but Jesus specifically says if someone strikes you on the right cheek. So which is your right cheek?
My right cheek.
Your right cheek. This one. And so the only way to do this is to either use my left hand or to use the back of my right hand. Yeah, we've got the demonstration. And left hands were for the toilet, and the backhanded slap was a tool for insulting someone, for contempt. So if you did either of these things, the left hand or the backhand to somebody, with equal social status to you, you would face an exorbitant fine, huge fine. But it was totally acceptable to slap your child, your slave, or your wife, as I have done here, if you were trying to put them in their place. So the backhanded slap was a tool of contempt and humiliation, saying, remember who you are. You can't be like that. But turning the other cheek says, here's my left cheek. Treat me as your equal. Punch me if you want, but I deny you the power to humiliate me. So, thank you. I don't know. Appreciate it. Yes, thank you. So they very well might punch you if you offer them your left cheek. None of these holy mischief responses preclude further violence. But regardless of what happens next, by refusing to flee and refusing to mirror the evil, Denise has changed the playing field and reclaimed her humanity. So that's turning the other cheek. Example 2. Someone suing you for your coat. So men in Jesus' time wore 2 pieces of clothing. They wore a coat on top and a tunic or robe underneath, which is translated shirt here, which is a bit confusing. But it was like the robe that you see on Jesus on the paintings. And sometimes the outer coat doubled as a blanket for sleeping at night. Some of you may already have figured out why I didn't ask for a volunteer for this one. Because being sued for your tunic and then offering up your coat would leave you naked in the courtroom. Jesus wants us to go naked instead of fighting back. Holy mischief. Now, nakedness is not usually linked to dignity. But in that culture, shame would fall on the person viewing or causing the nakedness. So in this case, the shame is not on the naked person, but on the one suing them, and on the corrupt court that's causing all this to happen. Clothing would often be taken by the court if someone couldn't pay a debt. And with what we know about that time, Israel under Roman occupation, almost everyone listening to Jesus would have been trapped in some kind of cycle of debt. It was a real problem for low-income people who were just trying to survive at that time. And the law of Moses tried to protect people in debt by requiring that someone's coat be returned to them so they could sleep under it at night. Actually, I think last week at Church in the Small, that was one of our questions. Tracy won our game for how well you know the Old Testament law, but you had to return the coat. So beating the court to the punch and giving your coat would remind them of this, would unmask the corruption in the system. I think this is also why Jesus mentions giving to those who ask to borrow in part of this section. I think he knows that we need a change in our hearts to shift our broken economy. Okay, example 3, going the extra mile. We're just amping it up here. Now again, the vocabulary Jesus uses for this extra mile is military related. It was common practice for Roman soldiers to force the people whose land they colonized to carry their military equipment. Kind of like when Simon of Cyrene was forced to carry Jesus' cross. Records show that a 1-mile limit had to be enforced because the soldiers were power tripping and pushing people too far. So what would happen if at the end of the mile of literally carrying your colonizers' war tools on your back, you worked some holy mischief and refused to give the power-tripping soldier his equipment back, insisting on carrying it farther, of your own free will, not being forced. Now the soldier would think to himself, okay, is this person just being kind? Is this like an insult to my own strength? Am I being provoked here? Will this person report me? Will I get in trouble? So imagine a soldier actually begging you to give his pack back to him in this situation. Again, the power has shifted and you've asserted your freedom, and the situation. Now, these are all first century Middle Eastern examples that don't really work today, but the core injustices remain. The backhanded contempt of those considered lesser. The injustice of a system that keeps people indebted. And an imperial power exploiting a colonized people. So our challenge today is to find imagination for how to have holy mischief kind of responses that fit now. One thing to notice is that Jesus' examples all play with the element of surprise, right? They catch the oppressor off guard with humor or with theater, and suddenly they're thrust into a different playing field. They're not in control in the same way that they were at the beginning. And the pressure is on them to figure out how they can respond to this without to save face and not embarrass themselves. Sometimes those moments of creative tension can lead to changes of heart. I don't know if you've heard the modern example of James Lawson, who organized the Nashville sit-ins in the 1960s. So he and other black activists would sit at the whites-only lunch counters, and when white people would kind of come and pester them and beat them and scream at them to move, they committed to sitting still and to refusing to flee, but also refusing to fight back. And at one counter, a man screamed a racial slur at Lawson and spit in his face. And Lawson responded with holy mischief by calmly asking him if he had a handkerchief he could borrow. And the man was thrown off and without thinking just offered him the handkerchief. And as Lawson was just wiping his face off, he noticed a motorcycle nearby. So he asked the man if the motorcycle was his, and they started chatting about motorbikes. And by the end of this conversation, the man had softened so much that he asked if he could do anything to help the activists. Of course, there's no guarantee that that will be the outcome of your holy mischief. Sometimes it ends up provoking even more violence. But by reclaiming your inherent dignity to respond as their equal, you will have robbed their power to degrade you. And usually by this point, others will be paying attention, and your defiance will spark imagination and motivation in other people. Residents of the village of Bil'in in the West Bank have been very creative in their nonviolent responses to Israeli occupation. One day for a protest, they all painted themselves blue and dressed like the indigenous people from the movie Avatar. Has anyone seen Avatar? So in that movie, these indigenous people actually are victorious over their colonizers. So seeing a bunch of blue people confused the Israeli soldiers who were sent to stop them and caught the sympathetic attention of the media. Holy mischief. Now it's entirely possible to do all of this creative cheek-turning and extra-miling, driven by your own hatred and contempt, with a desire to degrade and humiliate your enemy in the same way that you yourself have been degraded and humiliated. But that is not true holy mischief. The point is to defeat injustice, not to defeat people. And I think that's why Jesus follows these examples with one final, biggest of all buts, the one about loving our enemies. Jesus is pushing us deeper, preparing us not just for triumph over enemies, but for the larger goal of a fully reconciled, beloved community, as Martin Luther King Jr. called it, that includes our enemies. Right in the midst of our oppression, Jesus asks us to love. But the kind of agape love for enemies that Jesus describes is not a warm, fuzzy feeling towards someone that's hurting you. It's an act of choice, an act of the will. It's a determination to will the good of another even when they don't deserve it. Because we know that we ourselves have been loved when we did not deserve it by a God who recklessly, overwhelmingly, never-endingly loves us. A God who sends sunshine and rain on all of us, indiscriminately. Jesus is calling us to live into our identity as children of this God, to access the uncalculating agape love that God has for all of us. That is what makes us salty and bright and countercultural. When we are able to go beyond reciprocity, beyond what someone deserves, and serve our love unconditionally. The secret, I think, is in Jesus' second phrase here. Pray for those who persecute you. Because sometimes we need to keep our distance from our enemy, from our abuser, from our colonizer, whether for our own health, physical protection, emotional health. I don't think love always means putting ourselves in the path of someone who has proven that they want to harm us. but we can still practice prayer for our enemies as a form of long-distance love. Jesus modeled this from the cross and in the Lord's Prayer. And when we do encounter our enemies in person, Jesus challenges us to greet them. He says, if you don't greet them, how are you better than the pagans? And in Hebrew, the greeting was Shalom Aleichem, or peace be with you. So this too was a form of prayer, really, a blessing of peace. Now, I don't want to pretend that this is easy. I don't want to sweep all of our pain under the pulpit. Definitely sometimes people wound us so deeply that it feels impossible to do this. And some forgivenesses can take a lifetime and be extremely raw and complex. And I'll be the first to admit that I've never been face to face with someone who wanted to kill me personally. And I can't pretend that I'd be able to meet them with shalom in that case. But I know that aiming to do so would be not only a selfless act, but a selfish one. Because I know that hatred and unforgiveness wound me as well, and poison me, and rob me of life. So this is an attempt at healing for everybody involved. All of this has got me thinking about Grayson Fitz. Last Sunday, Grayson, a police detective, preached a sermon in his Baptist church in Tennessee, in which he said that queer people like me are the enemies of God. He believes Christians should hate the people that God hates, and therefore they should hate me, hate queer people, and call on the government to arrest us and put us to death, which is pretty awful coming from someone who actually works in that system. And I've been asking myself, what if Grayson didn't live in Tennessee, 3 hours from where my aunt lives, but what if he lived here? And what if I saw him at a Pride event? And what if he actually told me to my face that he wants me and my wife dead, and my friends? In that moment, would I have deep enough wells of love to draw on, to find empathy with the fear that so evidently drives him, without downplaying or excusing his actions and his words? To feel sadness for the smallness of his God, for the limits of his love? Would I be able to imagine him enjoying God's reconciled reign and kingdom with me? Would I have the creativity to come up with a holy mischief kind of response, to reclaim my humanity without degrading his? And I honestly don't know. I think this is the kind of thing that takes a lot of practice, spiritual, contemplative practice. And that's why I'm going to help us practice. We're going to do a meditation a little later in the service together. And the goal of our practice is to be perfect. To be perfect as God is perfect. And that sounds daunting. But it helped me to know that the book of Luke phrases it, be merciful, as God, your father, your mother, is merciful. This is not the cold perfection of faultless moral virtue. It's warm, it's maturing in our mercy, in our wholeheartedness. It's deepening those wells of love and widening our spirit to welcome more in. This is the telos, the end goal of our teleoi, or perfection, which is the word in this passage, teleoi. To become complete in our love, to become fully human. And because this is God's dream for us, we can expect God's help in this. God is not this hovering judge just waiting for us to screw up and demanding perfection. I think God is too busy reminding us that we're beloved children. And Jesus is too busy being our big brother, pointing the way forward. And the Spirit is busy enlivening our imagination for holy mischief, for truth, for healing, for love. For you, for me, for the world, even for Grayson. So let's reflect on that for a second. Shalom Aleichem.